Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 222. So, back on the continent. Last time we saw the abrupt fall from grace of Anne Boleyn and the Boleyn faction in England. However, Thomas Cromwell and Archbishop Cranmer escaped the fallout unscathed, for the moment. For the past several episodes, we've focused entirely on England, as Henry's great matter led to and then sailed right on past the English Reformation. Today it's high time we turn back to the continent. And yes, I can hear half of you screaming about my Western bias. Don't worry, we're getting back to Eastern Europe here soon, I promise. Anyway, Francis is free and ready to repudiate everything he promised while in Charles's custody, which, come on, dude. How didn't you see that coming? But anyway, I guess he didn't. And so, as you can imagine, European affairs are about to devolve into a complete disaster. Dump the Reformation on top of that, and my goodness, this is about to be fun. The summer of 1526 was one to forget for Charles. It opened with Francis repudiating the treaty which had set him free. Francis quickly allied himself with the papacy, Henry VIII, and several other independent states. Ambassadors from these various kingdoms presented themselves in turn to Charles, demanding that he give up his claims to Burgundy and Milan and set Francis's sons free. Charles rejected each of these demands in turn. Then, in September, news arrived from the east that the Ottomans were again on the move. Before long, their armies would stand before the gates of Vienna. Charles could only massage his temples and groan. Charles did get some good news the following summer. On May the 21st, 1527, Empress Isabella went into labor. By all accounts, it was a difficult one, lasting 13 hours. Charles, in a break with tradition, never left his wife's side. While the midwife encouraged the silent Isabella to cry out and relieve her pain, the Empress only responded, quote, "Do not speak to me again, for even if I have to die, I will never scream." She did not die. Instead, she gave birth to the future King of Spain, Philip, named for Charles's father. But the good news was quickly followed by bad news from Italy. In June, word reached Valladolid that his army had run amok and sacked Rome. His soldiers had even stabled their horses in the Sistine Chapel. When the sleeping Pope was woken by, quote, the thundering of the harquebus and cannon, he got out of his bed in a panic and rushed for the underground passage that led to Castel San Angelo. Rome was soon overrun by imperial troops who, quote, looted without pause, took people prisoner, broke into people's homes. They showed no mercy, not even to Spaniards and Germans, nor made any exception for the Italian cardinals who supported the emperor. They turned the profane and sacred upside down, ransacking all the churches, stealing holy chalices and reliquaries containing the remnants of the saints. And the Lutherans especially treated such holy objects to their impiety. They even murdered the pious, who took refuge at the altars and tried to defend themselves with words and prayers. And they were not satisfied with gold, silver plate, and other loot that they came across or found hidden. But they imprisoned the citizens and made them pay ransom money. And some, admittedly not many, reached such perverse extremes as to torture people to find out where they had hidden their wealth. Clement soon opened up peace negotiations, effectively a prisoner. But he was utterly ignorant of the realities of war, and the discussions went nowhere. Charles might have been privately pleased that the Pope was now his prisoner, but he understood that this event was going to look terrible to the rest of Europe. Interestingly, his Latin secretary was of a different mind. He wrote that Charles had not ordered the desecration of Rome. God had willed it, as punishment for a corrupt Vatican. Meanwhile, back in France, Francis at first did little than tour his realm and enjoy his liberty. It was not long before he was searching for new romantic conquests, despite his recent engagement to Eleanor of Austria. His eye quickly fell on a striking 18-year-old named Anne de Pissu. When he was not attending his various mistresses, Francis had more sorrowful duties to get to. In his absence, both his wife, Claude, and 7-year-old daughter Charlotte had died. With the king back in his realm, their funerals could finally move forward. On November the 5th, 1526, Francis saw his wife and daughter interred in Notre Dame. From this point forward, Francis seems to have determined to make Paris his home, though the Parisians still despised him. Nevertheless, he turned his back on the Loire Valley, the site of so many former revelries, and concentrated on his kingdom's capital. Francis also came home with a different attitude towards kingship. He was now firmly committed to what we would call realpolitik. Francis would make and discard alliances with dizzying speed. No longer did he care about romantic notions of chivalry and loyalty. This was about winning. The best immediate example of this change, of course, was Francis's instant rejection of the Treaty of Madrid, as I mentioned. Francis believed that the demands made upon him during his imprisonment were outrageous. Now at his liberty, he was under no obligation to abide by them, and announced said intention the moment that he could. What this meant for his two sons, including the heir apparent, Francis didn't know or seemingly care. At first, Francis gave Charles's ambassadors all kinds of reasons based on absurd technicalities as to why the treaty had not yet been verified. For example, in March of 1526, he told Charles's men that he couldn't ratify the treaty because the Great Seal of France had been lost at the Battle of Pavia, and the engravers were still working on a new one. This was certainly a novel argument, but one that probably left Charles shaking his head in disbelief. In April, Francis complained that the treaty, unratified, had already been published in Rome, Florence, and Antwerp. This was a minor technicality at best, but it allowed Francis to argue the premature publication had enraged his subjects when they read that Francis had agreed to cede Burgundy to the empire. Francis claimed that his subjects were doubly angry because foreigners had been informed before the French. This wasn't true, but it gave Francis another excuse. It's not like Francis actually cared what his subjects thought anyway. He was an autocrat, and France was a monarchy, not a democracy. Francis recognized that, having just thrown out the treaty, peace with Charles was out of the question, at least for the moment. So he looked across the channel to Henry VIII for an alliance. Anglo-French relations had improved since Francis's release, not least because Henry concluded that Charles would be too powerful if he actually acquired Burgundy. So Francis flattered Henry with all sorts of platitudes, from his generosity at not invading France while he was locked up, to Henry's largely non-existent role in Francis's release. These compliments were diplomatic ploys, but they worked. On August the 8th, 1526, France and England agreed to follow a single foreign policy, and further agreed that neither kingdom would negotiate on its own with the empire. Then on April the 20th, 1527, the two nations joined a new Holy League against the empire, as I indicated. Charles remained desperate for Francis to ratify the treaty, both for the territorial advantage and to cement his own position as Europe's leading authority. But victory had its own cost in the 16th century. Soon, Charles's unpaid troops were milling about northern Italy, and before long they would pay the Pope an unwelcome visit, as we know. So it was with increased desperation that Charles continued to pester Francis to ratify the treaty. But finally, on May the 10th, 1527, the King's Council in France met for a formal session and declared that Francis would not hand over the Duchy of Burgundy. Burgundy would remain in French hands. The only concession the council was prepared to make to Charles was a cash ransom. Every other clause of the treaty it systematically invalidated. When Charles got the news, he nearly exploded with anger. He had one form of revenge at his disposal, and he did not wait long in taking it. He immediately ordered Francis's son's retainers sent to the galleys as slaves, and that the two boys should be removed from their quote-unquote honorable captivity, the condition within which Charles had agreed they would be kept, and instead move them to a prison-like situation in a castle just outside Valladolid. Now the future King of France and his brother were little better than prisoners, kept in the most demeaning of conditions. For the moment, Francis did not do anything to help them. After all, his situation had dramatically improved. Through a little good luck and careful alliances, Francis had more or less restored his position as it had been before Pavia. Ironically, and this is a quick aside, but I think it's interesting, the man who was really left out in the cold of all this was the Duke of Bourbon. He had no guarantee that the emperor would continue to support him, now that a peace treaty with Francis had been signed. He did have a guarantee that Francis hated him with the passion of 1,000 suns. So really left without options, it would be the Duke of Bourbon who would lead that ragtag army out of northern Italy and south to Rome. Bourbon's army of around 20,000 men progressed southward through Italy in the early months of 1527. They declined to attack Florence, but sacked several major towns on their way to Rome, where they brutally sacked the city and imprisoned Pope Clement. From Francis's perspective, the sack of Rome brought only one good result. The Duke of Bourbon died in the effort. Bourbon's death did not quell Francis's loathing of him. For the rest of his life, Francis would blame the traitor for the Battle of Pavia, his imprisonment, and, basically any bad misfortune that came his way. I wouldn't be surprised to have read that the King of France cursed the dead Bourbon each time he double-faulted in tennis. Another legacy of the sack of Rome was closer diplomatic relations between England and France. Both kingdoms were determined not to see another great European city suffer such a horrific fate. As I said, in August 1527, England and France signed a new peace treaty that envisioned a future marriage between Princess Mary and the Duke of Orleans. Francis and Henry further agreed that neither of them would attend a great church council so long as Clement remained a prisoner. Finally, Henry agreed to waive any objections he had to the marriage between Francis and Eleanor of Austria. Francis's energies and drive continued throughout the remainder of 1527. Freed from the privations of imprisonment, he exhibited a newfound boldness about his power and kingship. That autumn, he resumed his Italian campaigns, invading Naples and Parma. But he still wanted to at least appear regal in his aims. So on December 16th, he called an Assembly of Notables. This group, which included the nobility, clergy, and other leading citizens assembled in Paris with two goals in mind. First, the assembly was to rubber stamp Francis's decision to void the Treaty of Madrid. Second, it was to grant Francis new taxes so that he could ransom his sons, or if Charles wouldn't give them up, he would go to war to secure their release. Unsurprisingly, the assembly agreed to all the king's demands. The Treaty of Madrid was declared invalid, and the king was granted the means to force Charles to abandon his claim to Burgundy and see the release of the crown princes. This was a deliberate snub to Charles, who could now only obstinately refuse to release Francis's sons, resulting in a stalemate. In an insane what-if moment, Charles then challenged Francis to a duel to settle the matter. Francis formally accepted the challenge on March 28, 1528, but, spoiler alert, the duel never happens. Meanwhile, events in Italy, now the official battleground of Europe, continued apace. The Marshal of France-Lautrec was marching south and seemed unstoppable. He tore through Romagna before invading the northern border of Naples. Apulia fell to him without even seeming to try. Lautrec surrounded Naples while his Italian allies blockaded the port. It seemed as if a massive French victory was all but certain. Then the topsy-turvy world of 16th century politics intervened, and Francis snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. The uncle of the man commanding the blockade fleet told his nephew to sail away. This man, the ruler of Genoa, had captured the Prince of Orange the previous year. Francis collected the ransom on his behalf, but then he never passed it along. Feeling slighted, the ruler of Genoa commanded his nephew to leave Francis's service and join the emperor, which he dutifully did. Lautrec now had no chance of taking Naples, since the city could be effectively resupplied by sea. Making matters worse, an outbreak of cholera swept down on his army. His Italian advisors told him to break off the pointless siege and escape to the hills to avoid the epidemic. Lautrec refused, and it cost him. On August the 17th, he too succumbed to cholera and died. Leaderless, the French cause in Naples collapsed. The total collapse of the French cause in Italy had a few immediate impacts. For one, it saved the imperial cause in Italy. Moreover, on June 29, 1529, Pope Clement and Charles would sign a Treaty of Barcelona, committing the emperor to aid the Medici Pope in restoring Medici rule in Florence. Interestingly, this treaty actually results in Charles's coronation as Holy Roman Emperor. Neither man could have known it at the time, but it would be the last time that a pope would ever crown a Holy Roman Emperor. This might have been high tide for Charles. For the first time since the age of the Caesars, a single man appeared to dominate Europe. In a self-confident speech to the Council of Castile, Charles declared, "For many days I have struggled with my soul, trying to decide whether to follow my heart and go to Italy to receive the imperial crown. I have consulted with my advisors and corresponded with friends abroad, and I have thought about it for long hours. I am determined to go, and no advice nor counsel will persuade me otherwise." Charles left Isabella and a handful of Spaniards with political experience in charge of Spain and left for Rome. Isabella, by the way, who had no political experience when she became queen, would grow, in time, to be an effective regent during Charles's many absences. In 1528, a new opportunity arose for peace between France and the Empire. A friendship had developed between Charles's aunt, Margaret of Austria, and Louise, Francis's mother. In December 1528, Margaret's private secretary visited Paris, and during a meeting with Louise, discreetly informed her that a peace treaty between France and the Empire was highly desirable. As always seemed to happen to him, Charles's military victories came with a financial cost that he could not afford. Therefore, the formal talks began on July the 5th, 1529, and ended a month later. Louise, who was representing her son, did a fantastic job. So much so that the signed Treaty of Cambrai was known thereafter as the Treaty of the Ladies, on account of who had been most responsible for its agreement. It was formally signed on August the 3rd, 1529. Francis got the best compromise out of it he could have expected. He had to renounce any claims in Italy and surrender Arras, Lille, Tournai, and any sovereignty over Flanders. But Burgundy would remain French, in exchange for the payment of 2 million écus. And upon the payment of this cash, the two princes would be released. Charles did remain suspicious of the French king, who, after all, had previously agreed to terms, only to back out later. He therefore formed his own League of Italian States, supported by the Pope in 1529. That way, he could be sure that even if Francis suffered another characteristic change of heart, he would be able to keep the French out of Italy. All in all, I think the ladies' agreement probably reflected what the Treaty of Madrid should have looked like in the first place. Had Charles been more modest in his claims the first time around, he probably could have avoided a ton of heartache. While the French king might have been disheartened by the onerous financial terms of the agreement, at least now there was a path forward. A path that for Francis would result in him getting his sons back. And as Henry VIII could tell him, male heirs count for a lot. Meanwhile, Charles was basking in his glory. That July, he departed for Italy once more. He met Pope Clement outside Bologna. Charles moved the coronation further north because he was eager to get moving against both the Ottomans and the Lutherans, where he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor on February 24th, 1530. It was his birthday. Charles spent the summer of 1530 desperately trying to reconcile the Protestants and Catholics within the empire so that he could turn to the Ottomans. At this, he failed. The Diet of Augsburg was a complete disaster, with both sides hurling, quote-unquote, blood-curdling threats at the other. Then, in early 1531, the German princes formed the Schmaldic League to oppose any efforts to force them to return to the Roman Catholic Church. Charles did manage to secure a brief reprieve from the religious turmoil in 1532, when he was able to convince everyone to briefly unite in order to oppose the Ottoman advance. Charles assembled an imperial army of 150,000 infantry and 60,000 cavalry. This was too much for Suleiman the Magnificent, who ordered the Ottoman army to retreat. And here's a fun trivia fact. In celebration of the Ottoman retreat, Viennese bakers created a new pastry, a light buttery pastry shaped in the form of the Islamic crescent moon. Today, we still call these croissants. Now, as an aside, we're going to get much more into Eastern Europe in the next few months. I plan to cycle back around and hit all these decades from the Ottoman and Eastern perspective. So if you want more Ottoman history, be patient, it's coming. Meanwhile, back in France, Francis was having a difficult time coming up with the 2 million écus. Even after the amount was collected finally, Francis discovered unscrupulous officials had clipped the coinage. It was not enough, after all. Hence, Francis had to make a further appeal for funds. But by July the 1st, 1530, he had the money, and a mutually satisfactory transfer was agreed to at the river Bidassoa, a river in Basque County of northern Spain and southern France. At the same time, Francis and Eleanor of Austria were finally wed on the 7th of that same month, making Francis and Charles brothers-in-law and, hopefully, ending decades of discord in Western Europe. But marriage to Francis was never easy for anyone, Eleanor included. If she hoped that the unorthodox manner of their marriage would not preclude a greater affection between the two of them, she was going to be disappointed. Although not a cruel man, Francis felt an incompatibility with his new wife, and he was almost immediately unfaithful. Worse still, Francis found it impossible to conceal the repugnance he felt for his new wife. His mother Louise counseled him to remain faithful for the good of the alliance with Charles. But on September the 22nd, 1531, Louise finally succumbed to the tuberculosis she had been suffering through for years. She died at the age of 55. She had seen the prophecy completed and died knowing that her son remained the King of France. Her death was actually a financial windfall for Francis. Her personal possessions alone were valued at 150,000 écus, and her territories extended across large swaths of the kingdom. As Francis married and mourned, international standing continued to be his most important objective. To that end, his goal remained the acquisition of Milan, the windmill he would tilt at throughout his life. Now, while all this was going on, Henry had decided to divorce his wife and marry Anne Boleyn. Francis saw to it that a statement of support from the leading theologians from the University of Paris was issued in July 1530. They declared no pope had the authority to issue a dispensation allowing a man to marry his deceased brother's wife. It was a significant endorsement of Henry's case, and the English king was duly grateful. By the autumn of 1532, Francis and Henry were openly discussing how to frustrate Charles's goals in Italy, in direct contravention of the Ladies' Treaty. Although the two kings disingenuously claimed that their meeting was to discuss an anti-Ottoman alliance, in reality, they were talking about Henry's divorce and an overall anti-imperial strategy. Again, Francis had exactly zero interest in being honorable any longer. For his part, Henry believed that countering imperial designs in Italy would be the fastest way to get Clement out from under the emperor's thumb and get his marriage to Catherine annulled. Francis was only too happy to encourage these beliefs. On January the 25th, 1533, word reached Francis that Henry and Anne Boleyn had been secretly married. Francis smiled with approval. He had long countenanced the English king to take firmer control over the situation. When Pope Clement condemned the marriage in July of that same year, Francis interceded on Henry's behalf. Clement demanded that Henry annul the new marriage and take back Catherine. If he did not, then he'd be excommunicated. When the deadline came and went, Francis was able to get Clement to agree to give the English king more time. Speaking of Francis and Clement, they were scheduled to meet for a summit in October 1533, which coincided with the marriage of Catherine de' Medici to Francis's son Henri. At the summit, Francis suggested a papal-Franco alliance whose aim, inevitably, would be the recapture of Milan. Clement said that was impossible given the terms of his agreement with the emperor. Moreover, the issue of Henry's marriage was becoming increasingly urgent. Francis, acting on Henry's behalf, requested a 6-month extension before the excommunication came into effect. Clement gave him a month, but did agree that the entire matter could be submitted to a specially convened Franco-Papal Commission, which would meet later in Avignon. As we already know, this would be a moot point. Henry was duly excommunicated in March of 1534, but by then the English Reformation was well and truly underway. Henry's aberrant behavior had put a strain on relations between the two kings. Henry needed to stay allied with Francis, or he risked being alienated entirely from the continent. Nonetheless, the English king's unruly behavior had already done significant damage to the prospect of another grand anti-imperial alliance. Francis could not be seen fraternizing with a heretic, after all. Francis was also present at the marriage of his son to Catherine de' Medici. Catherine would prove in time to be one of the most influential women of the early modern age, and we're going to get into her in a big way in the future. Catherine would have immediately realized that the apple fell a long way from the tree when it came to Francis and Henri. Henri was taciturn and awkward. Francis actually had to cajole him into just enjoying his own wedding. Luckily for Catherine, it was not her marriage to Henri that would make her powerful, as we're going to see. After his failure to convince the Pope to join with him in an alliance against Charles, Francis turned to an unlikely would-be ally, the Ottomans. Technically, this isn't as shocking as it sounds. The first treaty of sorts between France and Ottoman Empire came back in 1500, when Louis XII and Sultan Bayezid II signed a series of trade and diplomatic concessions. Then, as you might remember, Francis's mother Louise sent a secret delegation while Francis was in prison in 1525, in an effort to drum up Ottoman pressure on the empire to get Francis out of custody. In the end, Francis's own agreement with Suleiman fell short of anything momentous. Basically, it was more of a gentleman's understanding not to let Charles get too powerful. But rumors of Francis's discussions with the Ottomans caused quite a stir throughout Europe. Thomas Cromwell remarked that no Christian scruple would deter Francis from bringing the Turk and the devil into the heart of Christendom, if that meant he got Milan. It was an exaggeration, but barely. To save face, Francis tried to make much out of his alliance with the Pope against the hated infidel. However, at the same time, he kept sending his ambassadors to meet with Suleiman. When Suleiman prepared to invade Austria in 1532, Francis sent messengers trying to get him to change his target to Italy, which, Francis assumed, would make it easier for him to swoop down on Milan. But by the time the messenger reached Suleiman, he had already crossed the Danube, and a change of target was logistically impossible. Suleiman backed down when Charles approached with his massive army, as I already mentioned anyway, so nothing came from Francis's scheming. Francis was a little bit more successful in North Africa, though. Kheyr ed-Din Barbarossa, the Sultan of Algiers, signed a treaty of mutual friendship with France in 1533. Frankly, for the moment, all this did was remove France as a potential target for Sultan's pirates. By mid-1534, Francis seemed to be in an enviable position. The Anglo-French alliance continued. Catherine de' Medici's marriage to Henri meant that relations with Pope Clement were sure to improve. And then, they weren't. That fall, Pope Clement died and was replaced by Pope Paul III on October the 13th. Said Pope Paul immediately announced he had no intention of paying the enormous dowry Clement had promised the French king. With a tentative papal alliance with France at an end, Suleiman and the Ottomans seemed like the best option. This is especially true after Barbarossa's conquest of Tunis in August 1534. Much of the Mediterranean was now in Muslim hands. Suleiman's representatives appeared that October. Out of this meeting, I'll say a very ambitious coalition was born. France and the Ottoman Empire would coordinate military actions against Charles. France would strike at it. Do I even need to say it at this point, folks? Milan. It's Milan. The Ottomans would invade Naples and strike at Sicily as well. England, Scotland, and Denmark, I guess for good measure, would also invade the empire. The new French ambassador to the Ottomans was given very clear instructions as to what he was supposed to do. Quote, Jean de la Forest, whom the king sends to meet with the Grand Signior, Suleiman the Magnificent, will first go from Marseille to Tunis, in Barbary, to meet with Sir Haridan, king of Algiers, who will direct him to Suleiman. To this objective, next summer he, the king of France, will send the military force he is preparing to recover what is unjustly occupied by the Duke of Savoy, and from there to attack the Genoese. This King Francis I strongly prays Sir Haridan, who has a powerful naval force as well as a convenient location, Tunisia, to attack the island of Corsica and other lands, locations, cities, ships, and subjects of Genoa, and not stop until they have accepted and recognized the King of France. The king, besides the above land force, will additionally help with his naval force, which will comprise at least 50 vessels, of which 30 galleys and the rest galleasses and other vessels, accompanied by one of the largest and most beautiful carracks that was ever seen on the sea. This fleet will accompany and escort the army of Sir Haridan, which will be refreshed and supplied by food and ammunition by the king, who, by these actions, will be grateful to achieve his aims, for which he will ever be highly grateful to Suleiman. End quote. Had all this gone to fruition, it would have resulted in a quasi-world war. Charles did not realize the extent of the problem suddenly facing him, but he was aware of Ottoman activities in the Mediterranean, specifically the fall of previously imperial-leaning Tunis into Ottoman hands. Charles was determined to win it back. He amassed his army at Barcelona and sailed for the ancient city of Carthage. He surprised the Ottomans and cruised to victory. When he returned to Europe, he was given the name Carolus Africanus, in a clear effort to draw a parallel between himself and the Caesars of old. To ram the imagery home, he even traveled to Rome to celebrate a quasi-triumph. Meanwhile, as 1535 wore on, Francis still needed some justification for going to war with Charles. The unfortunate part was that he didn't have any. Not that a lack of cause had ever stopped him in the past. Then, on October the 24th, the Duke of Milan died. As Charles was the duchy's overlord, and the Duke died without a male heir, it was up to him to decide who the next Duke would be. Francis jumped at the new opportunity. He wrote that his son, Henri, should be the new Duke of Milan. Now look, this never had any chance of succeeding. But that was not Francis's goal. He just wanted a reason to go to war. To play for time, Charles suggested that Milan might eventually someday become the property of Francis's third and favorite son, Charles. Of course, this was unacceptable to the French king, who was only looking for a reason to invade Milanese territory anyway. With casus belli in tow, Francis's plans swung into action. He signed a further agreement with Suleiman known as the Capitulations. The purpose of this agreement, from Francis's perspective, was to give him more influence and power in the Mediterranean. Essentially, French subjects living within the Ottoman Empire were now only answerable to the French consuls at Damascus or Alexandria. The agreement also deepened the growing link between France and the Ottomans in a way that certainly worried Charles. Now, Francis's next move might seem a bit bizarre. He invaded the Duchy of Savoy, not Milan. The Duchy of Savoy bordered Lake Geneva to the south. Francis asserted that its current ruler was illegally occupying the territory. He claimed that the duchy belonged to him through his mother. A dubious claim at best, but that was not Francis's concern. Throughout Europe, Francis's ridiculous claim that he had invaded Savoy out of self-defense was met with the contempt it deserved. Now, technically, Charles was the feudal overlord of Savoy, so this brought France and the empire to the verge of war. Again. Francis's invasion of Savoy in February 1536 initially achieved the intended effect. By the end of March, Turin, the capital of the duchy, had fallen into French hands. Charles, cautious about getting involved in a protracted and therefore expensive war with Francis, did not respond in a similar bellicose fashion. He offered a compromise, but in reality he was also playing for time. Charles was currently holed up in southern Italy and needed time to prepare his troops. Francis then invaded Milan. Charles was beside himself with fury this time. Determined to crush the French king once and for all, Charles went immediately to Rome, where he denounced Francis before the Pope. When the French ambassador present complained that he didn't understand Charles because Charles was speaking Spanish, Charles contemptuously responded, quote, "Understand that you cannot expect me to speak anything other than my Spanish tongue, which is so noble it should be learnt by every Christian." Pope Paul III tried to make negotiations between the two men work, but ultimately they led nowhere, as it was clear that Francis was not negotiating in good faith. Why anyone would think that he might be at this point boggles the mind, but I guess hope springs eternal. Charles finally acted in the summer of 1536. That July, he gave the order to invade Provence, officially triggering the next round of Franco-Italian wars. Meanwhile, back in England, Henry spent the summer of 1536 tied up in domestic matters. If Henry hoped that the execution of Anne Boleyn and his marriage to Jane Seymour might make his people adore him again in spite of all the religious turmoil, he needed to think again. By midsummer, much of the English countryside was engulfed in turmoil. The people of England had willingly gone along with Henry's cause for reform when they thought that he was assuming the title of head of the English Church to enact much-needed reform. But when the Articles of Faith appeared to usher in more reformed Christianity, people believed they had been duped. Many people still passionately loved appealing to the saints and their relics. For most people in England, the church with its myriad traditions and the festival calendar had always been the most stable thing in their lives. They were not about to let Henry, be he king or no, tear it down. At least, not without a fight. People looked at the dissolution of the monasteries, and they feared what it could mean. Would their king close all the churches and parishes next? Now, different parts of the realm rose at different times. One of the biggest rebellions was in Lincolnshire, which has hence become known as the Lincolnshire Rising. Priests, secular and regular, flocked to the cause, realizing that they were swiftly losing their rights. By October 6, 1536, the Lincolnshire Rising had swollen to over 10,000 rebels. They streamed into Lincoln and trashed the episcopal palace. The landed gentry quickly joined the rebellion. Some of these men did harbor grudges about some of the new legislation pouring out of Parliament. Some were concerned that, once the church had been brought down to size, Henry would turn on them and their ancient privileges. However, most of the gentry who joined the rebellion did so because they had to. There was no middle ground here. You were either with the rebellion or you were against it, and so many knuckled under. With an army of 10,000 approaching their estate, they signed up rather than watch an unruly mob destroy their property. Henry's reaction was, unsurprisingly, intemperate. He wondered openly how the commoners of one shire, quote, the most brute and beastly of this whole realm, end quote, now presumed to lecture him, the King of England, and the head of the church on religious matters. Henry dispatched the Duke of Suffolk with a well-equipped army to meet these rebels and ordered them to disperse. The Lincolnshire Rebellion lost its nerve and complied with said order on October the 11th. But before the embers of one rising burned themselves out, the North rose in rebellion. This time, the leader of said rebellion is worth mentioning because he's a bit remarkable. The man in question was Robert Aske. He had seen the Lincolnshire Rebellion firsthand and was impressed with what he saw. Aske was similar to Thomas More in many ways. He was a civil lawyer, but passionately devoted to the cause of defending the church. While More just impotently looked on as Henry dismantled the church, Aske nearly succeeded in restoring it. On October 11th, as a spate of new uprisings broke out, Aske issued a proclamation calling upon his countrymen to, quote, preserve the church of God from spoiling. When these new pilgrims took up arms in the defense of their faith, Aske gave their uprising a familiar name, Crusade. For historians, this movement has come down to us as the Pilgrimage of Grace. By late October, 8 well-equipped rebel armies were on the march. Together they comprised some 50,000 fighting men. It was a far larger force than anything Henry could put into the field. By October the 16th, the rebels marched into York in triumph. It really did look like the clock was about to be turned back. On October 26th, the Duke of Norfolk drew up a much smaller army on the other side of the River Don, which cuts through Sheffield. While Norfolk proposed a truce, the rebels drew up ranks, anticipating a battle. This time, the hand of God, well, really the weather, I suppose, saved the day. Heavy rains made crossing the river impossible for either force. There would be no battle. But divisions within the rebel ranks now appeared. Many assumed that the host would march on London, quote, to sue the king, to have certain statutes revoked, and the makers punished. Norfolk continued to press for a peaceful resolution, secretly writing to Henry to, quote, take in good part whatever promises I shall make unto these rebels, for surely I shall observe no part thereof. In other words, Norfolk was stealing a page from Francis's playbook. For the next few weeks, the fate of the English Reformation literally balanced on a knife's edge. Indeed, for really the first time, there was a significant chance that Henry might lose his throne. Guess he wouldn't have to worry about the succession after all. Henry was apoplectic. He hastily wrote to Aske and the rebellion in general that he had done, quote, nothing that may not be defended by God's law and man's. The city of London steeled itself for what looked like an inevitable attack. Londoners could only hope that the rebellion, which, as I mentioned, now styled itself the Pilgrimage of Grace, would collapse like the Lincolnshire one had. But the Pilgrimage's resolution held for now. Even royal efforts to bribe various members of the Pilgrimage into betraying the movement failed. So on October 10th, the London aldermen confiscated all weapons larger than a meat knife from any and all priests in the city. No one knew who could be trusted any longer. In the end, it was not an army of 50,000 that decided the result of the Pilgrimage of Grace. It was the actions of a few nobles, notably the Earls of Shrewsbury, Derby, Cumberland, Huntingdon, and Rutland, as well as, of course, the powerful Duke of Norfolk. These men despised Thomas Cromwell and sympathized with the Pilgrimage's aims, but they had benefited a lot from the disillusion and the other changes in policy. Regions where these magnates had significant influence did not rise in rebellion, though they were good candidates to do so, at least on paper. These were rural districts, where the population had intense ties to their local parish, and frequently their local monastery, which had just been dissolved. But these powerful men kept their fingers firmly off the trigger. Only in the north, where Henry Percy, the indecisive Earl of Northumberland, ruled, did rebellion truly spread. Aske continued to believe that Henry would treat them kindly and might be persuaded to make some concessions. Henry, for the time being, complained that the demands of the Pilgrimage had made were just way too broad. Things like a restoration of some monastic orders and guarantees protecting saint days, etc., etc. Henry said these were all unhelpfully vague. Again, lay opposition to the Act of Succession at all had been muted in 1533-34 because no one really knew what the break with Rome meant. But in 1536, after the dissolution of the monasteries and prohibitions on preaching about purgatory and saints, it seemed to many English people that the only way to guarantee their traditional rights of faith would be to restore communion with Rome. Now it was Henry's turn to learn a lesson in humility. With Norfolk and Suffolk arguing there was no path forward other than a general pardon and the promise to call a free parliament, the king gave in. At a meeting with Aske on December the 6th, 1536, Norfolk relayed the king's offer. Aske accepted the terms and begged to be relieved from his duties as leader of the rebellion. He tore from his tunic the badge of the Pilgrimage of Grace. All others present likewise did the same and called out, quote, "We will all wear no badge nor sign, but the suit of our sovereign Lord." It seemed for a moment like the Pilgrimage had won a total victory. Aske even enjoyed Christmas with Henry and his new queen. Henry was in high spirits then, as Queen Jane had recently conceived. The commoners, however, were skeptical, both of Henry and his ministers and of the lords who had negotiated this deal without consulting them. They were right to be. Of all the parts of the deal, only the general pardon had been committed to writing. Of this free parliament that there was supposed to be, were only vague promises. The Pilgrimage of Grace ended where it began, Yorkshire. There, a disgruntled pilgrimage captain, suspicious of the king's intentions, attempted to rekindle the movement by taking the ports of Hull and Scarborough. His ill-fated rebellion began on January the 16th, 1537, and collapsed within a few days. But he had breached the peace. The pilgrimage had violated the general pardon. Henry now had the excuse he needed to do what he really wanted: crush the movement completely. Norfolk moved in, and now much of the landed gentry either supported the king or remained aloof. On February the 17th, a force of 6,000 rebels was crushed. The principal leaders of the rebellion, including Aske, were all summoned to London, tried, and executed for treason. The Pilgrimage of Grace belies the oft-cited argument that England was totally on board with the Reformation and the break with Rome. There was no immediate rebellion in 1533 because nobody knew what the result of all this was going to be. But when they saw the finished product in 1536, the largest rebellion of Henry's reign broke out. It very well might have cost him his throne. The failure of the Pilgrimage of Grace is explicable, but it's far from inevitable. What is important about it, though, is that the champions of the old order had well and truly risen. They had drawn themselves up to their full height, and they had been cut down. The Pilgrimage of Grace was the last real chance for the supporters of reunion with Rome to get what they wanted without going through the sovereign. Of course, Queen Mary will briefly restore union with Rome, but that was with her consent. For now, with Henry still alive, the Church of England was here to stay. Next week, Francis and Charles fight for northern Italy again, while Henry prevaricates on exactly what this new Christianity was going to be. As always, if you'd like more content, check out the website at westerncivpodcast.com. If you're interested in ad versions of the show for $1 a month, check out the Patreon feed, patreon.com/westerncivpodcast. And lastly, if you want to try a free trial of Western Civ 2.0, check out that link in the show notes.